Right, so let's go straight into our next chapter, okay, which is on ASEAN regional cooperation. So the objectives for chapter 4 is, of course, to be able to discuss the different areas of cooperation in ASEAN, again referring to the three areas of political, security, economic, and socio-cultural cooperation. Number 2, you should be able to discuss the various mechanisms of cooperation. So in each area of cooperation, there are various mechanisms or initiatives, right, that have been carried out by ASEAN in those different areas. So hopefully you'll be able to explain, or at least at the very least understand, what are those mechanisms about, or what are those initiatives about. And number 3, analyze the effectiveness of ASEAN's cooperation. Right. So after we have gone through all the different mechanisms or initiatives, then hopefully you'll be able to analyze yourself or to judge yourself on whether the regional cooperation within ASEAN has been effective or not, and what improvements that can be made in terms of ASEAN's regional cooperation. Right, so that's the aim of this chapter. As already mentioned, we have the three parts of chapter 4. Okay, so today we'll focus, or today and this Friday, we'll focus on the political and security cooperation. Okay, so these are the mechanisms that will be covered in part 1. Obviously, there are a lot more. Okay, so in the past, how many years is that? 50, almost 54 years. All right. So ASEAN has carried out numerous mechanisms or initiatives in all three areas. So we just focus on some of the more significant mechanisms, okay, when it comes to their regional cooperation. Right. So these are the things we'll cover today as well as on Friday's class. So we'll start with the first mechanism, known as the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting. So the AMM, or the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting, so we've seen this briefly back in chapter 3 in the structure of ASEAN. Okay, so under the ASEAN Summit, you have the different ministerial structures. Okay, the ASEAN Economic Ministers Meeting, the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting, the ASEAN Financial Ministers Meeting, and so on. Okay, so the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting is the ministerial meeting of the foreign ministers, menteri-menteri luar negara anggota ASEAN. Right, so it's a meeting of foreign ministers. So the main purpose of the AMM is to discuss the developments in terms of the political, security cooperation, as well as external relations in ASEAN, or the foreign relations. Okay, so they're responsible for that part of ASEAN's regional cooperation. Okay, when it comes to anything to do with political security and also foreign relations, this will be handled by the AMM, okay, or the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting. So the very first AMM was held on 8 August 1967. Okay, so in other words, the AMM is one of the very first mechanisms in ASEAN, because the AMM, or during this AMM, the first AMM, it is where the foreign ministers had signed the Bangkok Declaration, which resulted in the official creation of ASEAN itself. Right? So even before ASEAN was officially established on 8 August 1967, there was already the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting to have the signing of the ASEAN Declaration. And that's why it's one of the very first or the earliest mechanisms of political cooperation among the original 5 ASEAN member countries. So as of last year, there have been 53 ASEAN ministerial meetings. So what happens in these meetings is that, as mentioned just now, they discuss all the developments when it comes to the political security, cooperation, and foreign relations, and also any issues that deal with the political security, cooperation in ASEAN, and any issues when it comes to external relations. And at the end of every AMM, the foreign ministers will publish a statement, a joint statement known as a joint communique, right? A joint communique. So this is simply just a statement, sort of like a press statement, which summarizes all the things that they have discussed and all the things or all the decisions they have agreed on in the meeting. Okay, so everything is summarized in this joint communique or this joint statement. Right? So one particular issue when it comes to this AMM is that for just about every AMM, the foreign ministers have always, without fail, managed to publish the joint communique through consensus. Okay? So we say consensus, meaning that they all agree on what to publish in the joint communique. Okay? So they have never had disagreements in terms of what to publish, what to include in the joint communique. But in one particular incident, back in 2012, in the 45th for the CMM, so there was, for the very first time, the foreign ministers had a disagreement in terms of what would be published in the joint communique. Right? And the issue was regarding the territorial dispute in the South China Sea between certain ASEAN countries with China. Okay? And as I mentioned last time, we'll discuss more about this issue in chapter 6. But in this particular issue, it caused a brief disagreement. All right. So most of the countries in ASEAN, the foreign ministers at that time, wanted to publish in their statement to reprimand China for encroaching onto certain islands in the South China Sea that are being disputed between ASEAN and China. Okay, so dia dah tegur lebih kurang lah dalam statement dia nak buat teguran terhadap China yang telah menceroboh beberapa kawasan yang sedang dituntut oleh negara-negara ASEAN. But one of the member countries, in this case Cambodia, they did not want to publish that kind of statement because for Cambodia, they are very close allies with China. China is a very strong, very close ally and also partner at Cambodia, and they did not want to upset China by including this particular statement in the joint communique, and that caused a brief disagreement between the ASEAN member countries. Right? So in the end, they managed to resolve that particular argument and managed to, how you say, berbaik semula. Right? They managed to settle their differences, although they did not publish, I think, the statement itself. Okay, so although that, so this particular incident was mentioned by various observers and analysts by saying that this shows that ASEAN has the potential to have internal conflict. Right? So this issue of the South China Sea territorial dispute and the relationship between the ASEAN countries with China, okay, can become the main factor that might cause a breakup in ASEAN, okay, or internal conflict. Okay, and as we saw in chapter 2, or chapter 3, sorry, that internal conflict was among the factors that resulted in the failure of previous attempts at regional organizations. Okay, so this is something that ASEAN will need to be very careful about in the future, especially when it comes to the issue of the South China Sea territorial dispute, as it can become again the issue that could result in the weakening of ASEAN's regional cooperation. Right? Of course, others say it was just a minor incident, just a minor bump. Okay, and others argue that it can lead to more serious implications in the future. Okay, so that's something that needs to be looked at. Okay, in terms of ASEAN's political cooperation, in this case under the AMM, whether or not this particular issue will cause ASEAN to break up, or will they be able to continue to find ways to resolve those issues, right? So that is the first mechanism, the AMM, as well as the issue related to this mechanism. All right, so now move on to the next mechanism for political cooperation, which is the Zone of Peace, Freedom and Neutrality, or ZOPFAN, in 1971. So ZOPFAN, also known as the Kuala Lumpur Declaration of 1971. So this concept of ZOPFAN was actually the idea of our second Prime Minister, Tun Abdul Razak, and it was mainly due to his own national policy approach of what you call neutrality and also non-alignment. Right? So Dasar Berkecuali, which was implemented in Tun Abdul Razak's own domestic or national policies. So he wanted to bring that approach to ASEAN, and that's where he proposed this idea of ZOPFAN, which became the KL Declaration of 1971. So it was one of the first initiatives to ensure the stability and peace in the region, right? And this will be followed by other initiatives later on with the same purpose, okay, to ensure the stability, the security, and to maintain the peace in the region. So for ZOPFAN, and like many other initiatives that we'll come across later on, so a lot of the initiatives or mechanisms were influenced by various events, whether in the region or globally. Right? This is very common for any initiative or mechanism in regional organizations, whether in ASEAN or in Europe and so on. So in the case of ZOPFAN, it was influenced by the development of the Cold War running in. So hopefully you are aware of this Cold War, right? You can always look up it on. So it's basically a war of ideology. After World War II, there was this ideological warfare between the democratic powers in the West, led by the US, and the communist powers in the East, led by the Soviet Union, as well as China. Right? So both sides were trying to ensure that their ideology would be accepted by other countries. And besides that, you also had the developments going on in Vietnam, with the conflict with the communist insurgents in Vietnam. So these events have influenced the idea of Zopfan, right, to make ASEAN into a zone that is neutral, ataupun rantau yang berkecuali, a region that is neutral. So these are the events that influence the creation of Zopfan. So Zopfan is, as we have seen, an acronym, for these different concepts. So the zone is a concept referring to not just the ASEAN countries, but the entire region of Southeast Asia. Okay? So the implementation of Zopfan would not just be limited to the ASEAN member countries. They want to apply Zopfan to the whole region of Southeast Asia, right? And then peace, referring to ASEAN wanting to establish a peaceful and orderly relationship between each other, between the member countries, as well as establishing peaceful and orderly relationship with other countries around the world, regardless of their ideology. So it doesn't matter whether you are a democratic nation, whether you are a communist nation, ASEAN wants to establish peaceful relations with any country. Right? Again, regardless of the ideology. Right? And then for freedom, meaning that the aim of Zopfan is to ensure that ASEAN and the region of South Asia as well remains free from control, interference, or domination by other countries or other regions, especially the major powers or the superpowers at the time, like the US and the Soviet Union. Okay. And again, as mentioned now, is influenced by the Cold War. So both of these sides, the US led democratic powers and the Soviet Union led communist powers, were each trying to influence other countries to accept their ideology. Right? And they were also trying to establish some control over the smaller countries so that they can accept their ideology, whether it's democracy or communism. But for ASEAN, we want to remain free from these kind of influences. Right? So if the US and Soviet Union, they want to fight each other over their ideologies, okay, they can do that. They are free to do that, but they should leave ASEAN out of it. Okay, leave Southeast Asia out of their ideology war. Okay? So they should not try to do anything to interfere in ASEAN's affairs, or not. They should not try to control ASEAN, okay? Or they should not try to dominate over ASEAN or Southeast Asia. So we want to remain a region that is free from this kind of conflict, right? And finally, neutrality, the N for neutrality, meaning that ASEAN and Southeast Asia wants to maintain its impartiality, berkecuali, impartial, or non-aligned. It also means berkecuali, right? So we want to maintain our impartiality in any conflict that's going on, whether in the region or around the world, right? So initially, of course, it applied to the Cold War, but this would also apply later on to other conflicts that have occurred or is currently happening around the world. Right? But initially, it was applied to the Cold War between the East and the West powers. So we want to remain neutral. We don't want to choose sides, in other words. Right? So ASEAN, dia tak nak menyebelahi mana-mana pihak dalam perang ideologi antara kuasa Barat, US dan juga Eropah Barat, and also kuasa komunis di Timur dengan Kesatuan Soviet dan juga China. Right? So we want to remain neutral and don't choose sides. And again, going back to the peace concept, we want to establish good relations with both sides, okay, with the democratic countries as well as the communist countries. Okay, so that's the idea behind ZOPFAN. Okay, next is the Bali Concord, 1976. So as we discussed in chapter 3, the Bali Concord, or the Declaration of ASEAN Concord, 1976 was the first document to elaborate on ASEAN's initiatives to enhance their regional integration, which covers the three areas of political security, economy, and social culture. So in this part, we'll look at what ASEAN had planned in the Bali Concord when it comes to political cooperation. Right, so it had divided into several categories. One is the objectives and principles. Right, so we won't go to all the things in detail. So we just look at a few of them to get some ideas in terms of the objectives and principles of ASEAN when it came to the political cooperation in the Bali Concord. And again, we need to keep in mind that at this particular time, there were still only 5 member countries in ASEAN. Right, in 1976, so still the original 5 countries. So among the things that they had discussed in terms of the political cooperation in the Bali Concord is to eliminate the subversive threats. Right? So they agreed to work together to eliminate these underground movements that were threats to the security of ASEAN countries. Right? So obviously, at that point, they were referring to the communist threats. Okay? So subversive mainly, those are underground movements. Right? So a way for them to refer to the communist threats. So they agreed to work together to deal with that threat. Right, and then it discussed about the ZOPFAN. So we already discussed that just now. Okay, to quickly apply the concepts of ZOPFAN in the region. Economic and social development, and again, like was mentioned in chapter 3, so ASEAN is more or less applying the neo-functional approach with the spillover effect. So they argue that if you want to achieve the political stability, you must first of all ensure economic and social growth or progress. Right? So they work together to ensure that the member countries can develop the economy as well as society, and this will ensure the stability and security of the region. Right? And then the assistance due to natural disasters. So even back then, the ASEAN countries had identified, or they were aware that even natural disasters can result in instability to the security of the country that was hit by the natural disasters, whether it's earthquakes or tsunamis or hurricanes or volcano eruptions or whatever it is. Right? So they were already aware of this implications of the natural disasters towards the political stability or security. Right? So obviously, when a country is hit by natural disaster, the security forces of that country would be more focused on the rescue efforts, right, to help out with the victims and so on. And this will leave the country vulnerable to any entity that wants to cause instability to the country. So to avoid that kind of situation, the ASEAN countries agree that if any country is hit by a natural disaster, so the other ASEAN member countries will help provide with the assistance in terms of the rescue, search and rescue, help them with the medical supplies and also the shelter and food and so on, so that the country's security forces can focus more on maintaining the security of their country. Right? So even the natural disasters have some implications, okay, when it comes to the security or the political security elements. Right? And then national and regional development programs is again the cooperation in terms of these programs. Peaceful settlement of intra-regional differences. Okay? So again, a key characteristic of ASEAN is that they always try to find peaceful or diplomatic approach to resolve any intra-regional differences or disputes. So intra-regional meaning within the region of ASEAN. In that example mentioned just now, when it came to the dispute during the 45th AMM, right? So that was a dispute, an internal conflict, and they managed to resolve it peacefully using diplomacy and so on. Okay? So that's what ASEAN wants to keep doing, okay, in terms of their political cooperation. Okay, mutual respect and mutual benefit. So again, mostly referring to the fundamental principles, right, of ASEAN, as we saw in Chapter 3, the TAC. Right, so that in terms of ensuring the political cooperation and also security is that you must have mutual respect for each other. Okay? So that will create a conducive environment to strengthen the cooperation and establish regional identity and a strong ASEAN community. Okay? So again, since way back in 1976, ASEAN has tried to establish some kind of common identity that we can share with each other. And again, when you have a common identity, this will also create the willingness to strengthen cooperation between the ASEAN member countries. Right? So these were the objectives and principles, right, of the Bali Concord when it comes to the political cooperation. Okay, so the exact initiatives that they planned to do when it came to political cooperation was obviously the ASEAN summits will be the main mechanism. Okay. Jadi sidang kemuncak ASEAN akan menjadi mekanisme utama untuk membincangkan perkembangan dan juga kerjasama politik antara negara-negara ASEAN. Right? So that remains until now the main mechanism, okay, for political cooperation, which is through the meetings of the heads of government of ASEAN member countries. And then the TAC, yeah, again, that also becomes another main mechanism, very important mechanism for ASEAN, okay, when it comes to the political cooperation, the fundamental principles of ASEAN. And then to settle the disputes peacefully as well as quickly. Right? So it's not just about settling any intra-regional disputes peacefully using diplomacy and negotiations, but they must also resolve any disputes as soon as possible. Okay? So the longer that you leave a dispute unresolved, it can escalate. Okay? Or other groups or other parties might try to take advantage and cause more problems between the countries of ASEAN, right? So the faster you settle dispute, the better. And then for Zoppan, again, to ensure that the concept or the principle of Zoppan is recognized and respected, right? So not just between the ASEAN countries, they also want Zoppan to be recognized and respected by other countries around the world, especially the superpowers of the West and East, right? And then improve ASEAN machinery, so to improve all the different uh, structures in ASEAN that are related to the political cooperation. So they want to improve that. Extradition treaty. So extradition, I'm not sure whether you are familiar with the concept. Okay. So you want to extradite, meaning that you want to bring back a suspect, okay, who was apprehended in another country, and bring the person back to your country to face trial. So you are extraditing the person, right? And this involves the political cooperation. So you need to have the cooperation with the countries in terms of the law enforcement. And this requires very strong political cooperation. And I think until now there has not been that much in terms of this particular treaty. So I think they're still working out on the details of that particular aspect. And another important element when it comes to the political cooperation among ASEAN countries is that in order for them to maintain or to have and maintain the solidarity when it comes to the political cooperation, they need to have these three things. Okay, one is the harmonization of views, right? Harmonization of views, meaning that they share the same view on any political issue, right? They share the same view on any political issue. Number two, coordinating positions. So mereka ada pendirian yang sama terhadap apa-apa saja isu politik. And number three, taking common action. Mereka akan mengambil tindakan yang sama terhadap isu politik yang berkenaan. So these three things will ensure the political solidarity among the ASEAN countries, and that's something that ASEAN has tried to do for any political issue since then. Okay? They try to have the same view, the same position, and take the same action. And then the other one is on the security cooperation. So back then, they separated, right, political cooperation with security cooperation. Only nowadays they merge into political security cooperation. So in the Bali Concord back then, in 1976, what they had agreed on was the continuation of cooperation on a non-ASEAN basis between member countries in security matters in accordance with their mutual needs and interests. Right? So what they had agreed was that for security cooperation would be done on a country-to-country basis, not through ASEAN. Right? So at that particular time, ASEAN would not have a major role in security cooperation among the member countries. Right? And I think I did mention this back in chapter 2. This is one of the examples of the third mechanism for the neo-authoritarianism, which is the technocratic automaticity. Right? Technocratic automaticity, where it means that in the early stages of the regional organization, they have very little role in the regional cooperation. But later on, once the organization becomes stronger, they become more stable, then they will take over the role of the cooperation. And this is one example. Right? So again, 1976, ASEAN only 9 years old. It's still quite new. So at that stage, they were not involved in the security cooperation for the member countries of ASEAN. Right? It was done country to country or country by country. But now, after more than 50 years, ASEAN is the one that is managing the security cooperation in ASEAN. So they take over the role from the member countries, right? So that is the example you can use if you were to be asked a question on the mechanism of technocratic automaticity. Right, so let's continue with the next mechanism for political security cooperation in ASEAN, which is the Treaty of Amity Cooperation 1976, or the TAC for short. We've already gone through briefly back in chapter 3 regarding the TAC, whereby it contains the 6 fundamental principles of ASEAN. So there's a few other things to mention regarding the TAC. Firstly, the purpose of why ASEAN had established this TAC. The purpose was to promote perpetual peace, right? Promote everlasting amity, and promote cooperation among the member countries of ASEAN, right? So perpetual meaning continuous, right? To promote continuous peace among the member countries of ASEAN, promote everlasting amity. So amity here meaning friendship. Okay? So everlasting friendship among the member countries, especially, and promote the cooperation, right, between the ASEAN countries, especially. So amity or friendship, referring to the goal of developing and strengthening the traditional, cultural, and historical ties of friendship, good neighborliness, and cooperation among the member countries of ASEAN. Right? So the friendship that ASEAN wants to establish between each other is based on that traditional ties of friendship. So traditionally, the countries in Southeast Asia have had this bond of friendship between them, right? They have cultural ties, referring that most of the countries in the region share the same traditions and share the same culture, and that promotes the element of friendship among countries the same way it does between individuals, right? You share the same traditions, you share the same culture between people, and that often becomes the element that binds those people together in friendship. And we also have the historical ties of friendship. So history has shown us that we've had these relationships between the countries in Southeast Asia in the past. Even before ASEAN was established, before the countries gained independence, even before they were ruled by foreign powers, we had historical relations between each other, and they focus on those areas in terms of developing the friendship that we have now among the member countries of ASEAN. Right? And then cooperation, right? The cooperation part of the TAC is to promote active cooperation. Okay, so the concept of active cooperation is highlighted to indicate that for ASEAN, it's not just about cooperation. Okay, so cooperation, then there are different types of cooperation, right? So sometimes you have cooperation where only one side benefits from that cooperation and the other side does not. You have cooperation where only one side does all the work, but the other side does not. Okay, so again, cooperation is very general, and there are many types. So ASEAN has specified in the TAC that they want to promote active cooperation. So you say active cooperation in these areas, whether it's the political, economic, okay, but especially when it comes to economic and social areas. Active meaning that they want to have consistent and continuous cooperation, okay, almost non-stop. And that's something you can see in ASEAN until now. Okay, they are very active when it comes to cooperation in many different areas. Right? And this is also seen in the many initiatives that have been carried out by ASEAN since its creation in 1967. Okay, so ASEAN has been working almost non-stop, or they have been cooperating with each other, okay, or in many areas. So they are very active in the cooperation. So the idea is that when you have active cooperation, it means you are consistently interacting with each other. Right? So the ASEAN member countries are continuously interacting with each other because they are very active in their cooperation. And when they are constantly interacting with each other, this will also help to shape the friendship as well as uh, good relations between the member countries. Okay? And again, the same way that you apply to individuals, to people. Okay? When you have active cooperation between people, you develop that sense of friendship, you develop trust between each other, and this also applies to the countries in ASEAN. Okay? So we have very strong trust between each other, and we also have developed very good friendship between the member countries of ASEAN. Okay? And again, that's the element of active cooperation. And I think in the fundamental principles, the sixth one mentioned about effective cooperation. Right? So it's active cooperation as well as effective cooperation. So effective cooperation means that both sides benefit from the cooperation that is being done. Right? So it's a win-win. Okay. So whenever there's any cooperation between ASEAN countries, all those countries involved will benefit from the cooperation, and that's what we call effective cooperation. Right? And another element of TAC is the peaceful settlement of disputes. Again, it's already mentioned in the Bali Concord. Right? So any dispute, any arguments, any disagreements between the member countries of ASEAN, they will try to resolve through diplomatic approach. Right? And as mentioned as well in chapter 3, in the third summit, if I'm not mistaken, that they had the amendment to the protocol for the TAC, in which they opened the TAC for other countries to sign as well. Okay? So non-ASEAN countries would also be allowed to sign the TAC, and those countries that sign the TAC with ASEAN would also comply with the fundamental principles. Right? So in this map, right, so you can see that the darker blue, the darker shade of blue, referring to the original countries of ASEAN that signed the TAC, okay, in the 70s, the original 5 member countries, and then the lighter shade of blue will be the other ASEAN countries or the other Southeast Asian countries that signed the TAC after the amendment to the TAC in the 80s. Okay, so Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, right, and so on. So they all signed the TAC in the 80s, and the lighter shade after that in the 90s. Okay, so other countries also signed the TAC, and in the 21st century, okay, from the year 2000 onwards, you have the lightest shade of blue for those countries that have signed the TAC as well. So you can see that many countries have already signed the TAC with ASEAN, okay, including Australia, some of the major countries, the US, Russia, China, okay, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand, okay, Canada, the UK as well, and some countries in Europe have signed. And you can also notice that the countries in the gray countries are the ones that have not signed the TAC. Okay. So mainly those in Central America, South America, except for one country. I'm not sure which country is that. Okay, probably you can identify that one country in South America that has signed the TAC, but the rest have not. Africa, okay, has not signed the TAC with ASEAN. The Middle East, okay, Timur Tengah, which includes Saudi Arabia and all the other countries in the area, have not signed. Several countries in Eastern Europe and a few countries in Western Europe have not signed the TAC. Yeah, that's also something that you can try to study further in terms of identifying the reasons why those countries that were mentioned, Africa, right, Middle East, South America, Central America, they have not signed the TAC with ASEAN, right? So that's something you can try to look up. Okay, the last one to look at for today is the ASEAN Regional Forum, or the ARF, 1994. Right, so this was established under the 26th ASEAN Ministerial Meeting. So the ARF is an outcome of the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting. And the inaugural meeting, meaning the first meeting, was held in July 1994. So the mechanism of ARF is another example of a mechanism that was influenced by the developments going on globally, mostly. All right, so the event that led to the ARF was back in the late 80s and early 90s when you had the collapse of the Soviet Union. All right. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the global politics had shifted from a bipolar to a unipolar system. Right? And again, something discussed, I think, back in chapter 2, where you have under the realism, right, theory. So you have the before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that country and the US were the two major powers, or the two superpowers in global politics, the US and Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, okay, and they broke up into different countries, okay, which includes Russia, okay, nowadays referring to Russia, and also other countries. So that left the US alone with as being the major superpower. So other countries around the world and other regions around the world had to adapt to this shift in global power from a two-power structure of the Soviet Union and US into just the US, right? And they also need to be able to deal with any implications of that shift from a bipolar to unipolar system. And that's one of the reasons why ASEAN had decided to establish the ASEAN Regional Forum, or ARF. Right? So the ARF would act as a multilateral consultative forum aimed at promoting preventive diplomacy and confidence building among the states in the Asia-Pacific region. So that is the main purpose, the main goal of ASEAN Regional Forum, to act as a multilateral, meaning a forum that consists of various countries. Right? So the ARF does not only consist of ASEAN countries, but also any other country that has interest in Asia Pacific region. Right? So negara-negara yang ada kepentingan di rantau Asia Pasifik, mereka menjadi anggota ARF. As you can see in the membership in the other slides. Right? So as a multi-country or multilateral forum, so they are more of a consultative forum. Okay? They have consultations, they have discussions or talks. And the purpose of the talks is to promote basically two things. One is confidence building, and the second one is preventive diplomacy. So confidence building means that they try to build trust between the members of ARF. Okay, to build trust. So to build trust is in order to prevent those countries from having any conflict. Right? So if you build trust with each other, you are less likely to have conflict. And secondly, promote preventive diplomacy. So meaning that if any of the countries in ARF or members of ARF, if any of them have or are showing signs of having conflict or disputes, so ARF will use diplomacy to prevent those countries from escalating into conflict. Right? So that's the purpose of the ARF, okay, as a consultative forum. So the objective, again, is to foster constructive dialogue and consultation on the issues of political security of common interest. Okay? So they discuss, right, about any issue of politics and security in the region of the Asia Pacific. Okay? So any issue that is shared by the members of ARF will be discussed in that forum. Okay? Whether it's the issues of territorial dispute, whether the issue of terrorism, right? The issue of piracy, and so on. So any issue that deals with political security matters will be discussed by ARF. And secondly, as mentioned just now, is to promote these two concepts, right? Confidence building and preventive diplomacy in the region. So you can see there that the membership of or the participants of ARF again consists of countries around the world that have interest in the Asia Pacific region. Right? So obviously you have the countries in the region itself, right? With ASEAN countries, with Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, you have the East Asian countries, in Japan, North Korea, South Korea, China, Mongolia, okay, Australia, New Zealand. So these are the Asia Pacific region, as well as India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, the South Asian countries. And you have the other countries in the region or other regions around the world that share interests. Punya ada kepentingan, like Russia, the European Union, the US, and also Canada. Right? So these countries also have some interest, whether it's political, mainly political interest. Right? And you can also see that a lot of these countries that are participants of ARF, they are among the countries that have a history of conflict with each other. Okay, so you have the US and Russia, obviously, they have a long history of tensions. You have China and Japan, they have also a history of conflict. tensions, India, Pakistan as well, North Korea, South Korea. So all these countries that have potential for conflict, so they are brought together under ARF, and that is why they try to promote the confidence building. Okay, try to build confidence or trust between these countries that have potential for conflict, right? So that they can avoid any conflict with each other, which might have implications for the countries in the Asia Pacific region, right? So, if, for example, India, Pakistan, kalau mereka berperang, so, kemungkinan besar negara-negara yang berhampiran dengan India dan Pakistan seperti Myanmar, okay, sebagainya akan menerima kesan ataupun menerima tempias daripada konflik antara India dan Pakistan, right? Or if North Korea, South Korea go to war, then again other countries in the region might be affected, and that's why the RF wants to ensure that they can use their forum to build the confidence or trust between these countries that might have conflict, so that they will avoid going into conflict. And if any of these countries show signs of having conflict, then ARF will use the second approach, which is preventive diplomacy. So they bring these two countries, for example, they bring India, Pakistan to the negotiation table. They have discussions and talks and find a way to resolve whatever conflict they have or whatever dispute they have before it escalates, it escalates into conflict, right? That's the purpose of why we have this ARF, right? And lastly, the challenges. So again, these are just some general information on the challenges faced by ARF. So managing the shift in power relations. So like I mentioned earlier on, ARF itself was established to deal with the power relations from bipolar to unipolar system, right, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the next challenge is for ARF to manage any future shift in power relations. So for example, like as many analysts are mentioning, the shift from the US towards China as the next global power, right? So some argue that within the next few years, the China might replace the US as the global superpower. So how will ARF manage that change or shift in power relations, right? So that's a challenge for ARF. Recognize the diverse approach to peace and security and forge a consensual approach. So diverse membership, and each country will have different approach in terms of how to ensure peace and security. Like we all know, US, they are more prone to using force, okay? More prone to using aggression to establish peace and security, like they have done in the Middle East, right? But for us, for ASEAN, we prefer to use diplomatic approach to ensure peace and security. So there is a clash of approach, and that's the challenge of ARF, how to manage these diverse approaches to establish peace and security. And finally, to settle unresolved disputes and other differences. So that's the example of the South China Sea territorial dispute. So until now, ARF has not been that effective in helping ASEAN and China to resolve the territorial dispute in the South China Sea peacefully. So it's an ongoing challenge for ARF. And again, these are the mechanisms mentioned earlier on, right? Promote confidence building or trust, right, to avoid conflict. And if there's any sign of conflict, they move on to the next stage, which is preventive diplomacy. They bring the countries and negotiate and prevent the conflict from escalating. And if that fails, then the third mechanism they use is conflict resolution. So if the conflict does happen between any of the member countries of ARF, then they will try to bring those countries together and try to resolve the conflict as quickly as they can. All right, so those are the mechanisms used by ARF.